Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smart Human Podcast. On today's show, we're talking with Heather White. She's the founder and CEO of the nonprofit OneGreenThing.org, an author, environmental lawyer, consultant. Today, we're going to talk about her new book, One Green Thing, Discover Your Hidden Power to Help Save the Planet. We talk about greening our environment, sustainable choices and actions, and how you can make a difference. Hope you enjoy the show. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with an old friend, an incredible change maker, Heather White. She is founder and CEO of the nonprofit OneGreenThing.org, an author, environmental lawyer, consultant, motivational speaker, nonprofit executive, and former center staffer. She has more than 20 years experience in nonprofit management and environmental advocacy. She was the former president of the nonprofit partner to Yellowstone National Park, executive director of EWG, which is Environmental Working Group, director of education advocacy at the National Wildlife Foundation. She's also served as counsel on energy environment to United States Senator Russell Feingold, and associate at law firms such as Bass, Berry, Sims. Was a recount attorney and presidential campaign staffer for President Al Gore in 2000. And she is just, the list goes on and on for what you've had your hands in. So, I could be here all day. But I want to, first of all, welcome you to this podcast because I think your work really speaks for itself. And we'll get into that. Not only the past work you've done, but also your new book that you have coming out now called One Green Thing. And yes. I think that I'm going to start by asking you, number one, how did you even get here? How are you at this moment in your life? This is a very loaded question. With this book as a culmination of so many years of work in both the environment, but also environmental health. So tell me, what got you to this point?
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Dr. Cohen. I'm thrilled to be here. It's fun to be full circle after we met through environmental health and now to be talking about this book. Such a big question about, how did I get here? And I think my love for nature and the outdoors certainly started when I was little. My earliest memories with my parents is spending time outside. I grew up near the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in East Tennessee. So I spent a lot of time outdoors as a young person, but I also knew about nuclear waste dumps, about cancer clusters. Those were always in the background of growing up in a place that was so beautiful. Also questions of justice and access to clean air and clean water and safe places to live. So that was kind of those early experiences that made me passionate about the environment and passionate about science and policy. And I'd always kind of thought about this idea of a one green thing, like a daily practice of sustainability. And I feel like so much of what your advice is to your followers and your patients is looking at the whole person and thinking about your good habits, but also I'm thinking about taking time out for what matters to you and being aligned with your values, and part of that being self-care. And for me, it came about this idea of this daily practice of sustainability when I was an exchange student in New Zealand in the mid-90s. I studied conservation biology there, and I had this fun moment that I talk about in the book where I had been traveling by myself, which was a unique experience for me. I hadn't really spent so much time traveling alone, but I'd been backpacking for a couple weeks. I went to this gorgeous church on the South Island of New Zealand called Lake Tekapo, and it's called the Church of the Good Shepherd, and was just by myself, kind of staring out into this beautiful aquamarine lake, and realized that this is what I want to do. I want to make sure that if I ever have grandkids, they have an experience like this of connecting with these beautiful landscapes. And then and there, I decided two things. One, I wanted to be an environmental lawyer, and that I was going to go to law school. And the second is that I wanted to take time out each day to do kind of what I had thought of as a one green thing to connect with nature. And so that's kind of how it all started. And as you know, I worked in environmental health, and you went through all these fun experiences working in the Senate, political campaigns. But it was really my kids who brought me to write this book. because, and I can tell you more about that, but my daughters are now 14 and 16. But when my older daughter was 14, she wanted to participate in the global climate strike that Greta Thunberg had organized.
Yeah.
And we were having one here in Bozeman, Montana. And she said to me, Mom, can I go? And you're going to love this, Dr. Go. And I said, sure. It's going to rain though, and there's going to be thunderstorms, and you have a heavy backpack and you have a trumpet and everything. Why don't I just pick you up and I'll drive you to the protest site? And and I know you deal with like parents and grandparents, this idea of like, I want to protect my daughter from getting really wet in a thunderstorm.
The elements, yes.
The elements, yeah. And she was so angry with me and said, Mom, it's a walkout, first of all. And secondly, you're going to drive me to a climate strike. And then she
like
got
the
really
hypocrisy
upset.
of that, right? Yeah,
exactly. And then I felt like I needed to share my resume with her about all this work I had done in climate. And, I had had this whole concept, but it really, through her expressing her anger with baby boomers and Gen X and millennials, she just felt like this is all on our shoulder, the climate crisis is. So that brought me to studying the impacts of mental health and the climate crisis into writing this book, and kind of coming full circle from, my career to actually this idea of a parent and what is the legacy we're leaving our kids and how can we help them build a better future, which I know is so aligned with your practice and all that you do and talk about on the podcast.
I mean, it is. And, listen, what I love is that, first of all, we did not, by the way, get each a memo about what color sweater to wear. That must have been kindred spirits, because when you popped on, I was like, what? So we'll step around that for a second. But you and I met, I just want to talk about where we met, because it plays into, I think, the work you're doing now is, about 10, 12 years ago, we met because I was starting to get involved in environmental working group, and your head scientist down there had invited me down to Washington. I think I met you there first at your offices for environmental working group in Washington, which is interesting. You were living in a city and now you're living in like Bozeman, Montana, right? So that was kind of a big change. But and then we met at another fundraiser with Ken Cook and other members of environmental working group. And so I really got this impression of you as really being tied to sort of the chemical component of our environment. And, really, as your lawyer background, really having this perspective, as with EWG, is sort of the legalities of, or lack of regulation for these chemicals in our products. And so I guess I want you to touch on maybe, given your history working with the Yellowstone National Parks and some of the other environmental places, as opposed to sort of environmental products, how do those things tie together? And how does that mash up in your head in terms of what work you're doing now?
Oh, that's such a good question. It all relates to climate. I think what's happened, as you know, in the fall of last year, the United Nations, after they issued their latest international panel on climate change, the IPCC report, the head of the UN's declared a code red for humanity. So everything now in my world is related to climate. And that includes toxic chemical regulation. It includes plastic pollution. As you know, plastics break down and they release a lot of toxic chemicals that we have in consumer products. It connects to, water scarcity, drought. It really intersects everything. It also with respect to justice and issues of equity. So I think that we're all going to find in the next few years, and I don't think it's much longer, really like 2 or 3 years, that all of us are going to be looking at our jobs as climate jobs in many respects, even as integrative and functional medicine doctors and people who look at the whole person and are treating people. Climate is going to be front and center. And so I was really focused at EWG, you're absolutely right, looking at toxic chemicals in consumer products and the lack of regulation. And we had been on the forefront of really pushing to modernize the Toxic Substances Control Act. But we also did a lot of work on fracking chemicals that are used for natural gas. So that entry point of looking at chemicals in our environment and looking at our health, looking at water pollution, the Tap Water Atlas, for example, is a great resource that people have to just go to ewg.org and type in your zip code and see what are the chemical contaminants in your drinking water. All of that, the aspects of all of that work connects through the climate crisis, because we can't disconnect from each other. And I think, I'd love to hear your perspective too on this overlay of the pandemic experience, because I think that we have all learned in a very personal and deep way how interconnected we are through this global pandemic of COVID too. But that's how I kind of this journey of, it started when I was younger with nature and the outdoors. Then I went through policy and really focused on environmental health, and then came back out west here for Yellowstone, the world's first national park. It was kind of like you had me at Yellowstone, when I was talking to the folks out here. And then through my kids, weaving all of this together through the climate crisis and the future that we're leaving the next generation.
Yeah, so I'm so on board with what you've done and what you're doing and tying it all together. When you say about the COVID-19, I give an example that I think is sort of ties it together, and not just the emotional aspect, but just the sheer number of cleaning products that were added to the market that came from a place of real legitimate fear. If we remember in the beginning, not even just letting packages come into the house, we wiped down our packages. We were at such a place of the unknown that chemicals of any kind that could kill the bad guy, could kill the virus, it just exploded. In fact, they had contamination issues, with some of these hand cleaners, and it would just, the list goes on and on, using quaternary compounds and things that are just known carcinogens. And what's so interesting is what I say in my water talk is that this stuff goes right down the drain. This goes somewhere. It goes into our wastewater treatment plants that don't have the infrastructure to remove them. So they go into our environment. They challenge the environment. They can affect all things, the algae, kill off species. And they also go into our water again that comes right back at us to be our drinking water. So, if there was just one simple example that in what we're saying, it sort of ties these two worlds together, is that everything we do has an effect, not just on our environment, but perhaps even back to our own bodies again. So what are your ideas? So let's get into the book a little bit, because the book is spectacular. It's divided in 3 parts. Tell me a little bit about the way you designed the book, and then we'll kind of go into some of the details.
Thank you so much. I think many people, as they start to learn more about environmental health, whether they start with cleaners or they start with the climate crisis or they start with carcinogens, they have a diagnosis, or someone they love has a diagnosis, and they start thinking about what they're bringing into their home and bringing into their bodies. I think once you start down this path, it is very overwhelming. And that's what inspired me to write this book, is that most people that I love and know that want to get involved in the climate movement, which I now consider encompasses everything in the environmental movement, they don't know where to start because the issue is so overwhelming. And so the first part of the book is I have done a personality assessment. And the assessment is kind of like Strength Finders, if you're familiar with that, or Myers-Briggs. I ask, who are you in service? What are your strengths when you show up for other people? And I call that the service superpower. And then I have 7 different profiles of people, just based on my experience, more than 20 years experience in environmental advocacy, of how people show up for others. And then I have some really great folks who I call eco-heroes, who exemplify those different personality types. So you can kind of see, okay, yeah, I really do connect with Maya Penn, who is a Gen Zer philanthropist, oh, wow, Robin O'Brien, food activist, she's a beacon, that really connects with me too. Or Mark Hyman, he's a sage, he's a Buddhist and really inspired by working in functional medicine through his spirituality. And that connects with me too. And then the second part of the book is, how do you apply your service personality to different areas of change? And I actually kind of get you kickstarted with a 21-day action plan, which Dr. Cohen I think will get a kick out of.
I wrote that down.
Just like a wellness plan, right? Like I'm sure there's different protocols that you will give to your patients and other folks that are interested in your work. So it's just, let's just do one thing each day. Let's just do a green thing each day. And it doesn't have to be calling a member of Congress. It doesn't have to be buying solar panels, but you can start with a cleaner. Like today you're just going to make a better choice at the grocery store for a green cleaner. Or maybe you're going to take a walk outside with a person that you love. Or maybe you'll share an article about an issue that's really important to you. So it's just this idea of having that daily practice. So And then in the second part of the book, I look at all these different issues. I start with community connection and compassion, which I think is so much about what you have created with the Smart Human podcast, that importance of community and compassion. And then I talk about this idea of think beyond your age, which is an intergenerational partnership. What type of ancestor do you want to be? What is your legacy going to be? And how can you connect with young people today and give them hope, but also let them know they're not alone? And then I look at food, water, energy, wildlife. And then the third part of the book just simply says it's up to you. That's the future that we can create together can be something that's remarkable and beautiful. It's not just, as we've talked about, I know we've talked about this in the environmental health space before. Sometimes it feels like we're all going to die. It feels like something like it's a doomsday, everything's out to get you. And we have to kind of shift that narrative to, it is serious. The science is very compelling and it is scary. At the same time, we can fix it and create something really beautiful to work toward.
And that's what I see as the overwhelming message in the book, is that it's meant to be productive and proactive, but it's also not meant to shut you down. I mean, even when you're, when we talk about, like you said, you did this sort of 21-day Kickstarter and also a survey of sort of who you are as a person, you kind of have to know who you are to see whether or not you're willing to jump in at which level of change.
Exactly.
And I think that's really critical, because you have to know yourself. Otherwise, you might feel like you're disappointing yourself or the movement or whatever your expectations are. So I think that's kind of brilliant to know who you are, so you know kind of what's the next step of what you can do to make a difference. What do you say to people that feel like they're just one person? I mean, I'm sure you've heard this before. What do you when you're just one person, how can you really, create that much change that's going to make a difference, that's really going to stop this sort of freight train that's rolling down at 100 miles an hour?
Oh, such an excellent question. I get that a lot. And I actually get it from Gen Z. And those are kids born after 1997 to 2017. So, mostly the teenagers that we're dealing with right now and young folks, is this idea of we need systemic change, right? Like even Dr. Cohen is not going to be able to get climate legislation passed, right? Me skipping the straw, my kids actually tease me about skipping the straw. My older daughter posted something recently on social media that was a picture of a Nigerian oil spill. And she said, "Oh, I'm skipping the straw, doing my part." Really being very sarcastic.
Facetious.
Obviously.
Yeah, of course.
Exactly.
They're good at that. My kids too. Yeah.
They're very good at that.
Okay.
But then I had to say to her, what are you supposed to do? You're a 16-year-old in Bozeman, Montana, and there's an oil spill in Nigeria. What are you supposed to do? And the reality is, in my view, skipping the straw, of course, is not going to solve that problem. But in your town, you're sending a signal to wherever you are, to the barista, to the owner, that that's not what you want. Single-use plastic is not a value of you as a customer, and you're using your voice in some way. That is not going to solve the crisis, but you're doing what you can. And you have to control what you can control. And what I think is very important in this book is what I say is that it's not about your individual carbon footprint. And even that idea, interestingly, was first put out on a broad scale by BP, the oil company. It was an oil company campaign to try to kind of shift this focus of climate change to individuals as opposed to the reality that our energy and transportation
choices. Just like smoking and flame retardant chemicals and couches was actually not about the flame retardants themselves, because God forbid that would change market share. It was actually about telling people that they were going to burn up in 12 seconds if they didn't have these in their couches. When
exactly.
In fact, it was the smoking industry didn't want to take responsibility, the tobacco industry, I should say.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of,
that's such a great and insightful parallel for sure. And so what I say in the book is that it's not about your individual carbon footprint. Although, we do all add up when we're focused on that. It's more about culture change and your individual influence in your community, in your town, in your family, and the choices that you make can educate and inspire others and shift the culture for these big systemic solutions that we need, whether it's climate change legislation, whether it's, Paris Accord and making that more vibrant and internationally successful. That all starts with us. But this idea of where does the individual fit in, I think is really critical for the movement, and understanding it's not as much about math as it is about the culture shift we need.
Oh, I think that's brilliant because it's true. People are worried that if they take a couple extra flights a year, they've somehow ruined the planet or,
Right.
and it's this carbon footprint in our head that makes us feel so responsible. But the little things that you do add up. I mean, even here in New Jersey, I know in May 1st, they're starting to get rid of plastic bags in supermarkets.
Yeah.
I rarely see straws that aren't paper. I mean, maybe they have their own issues, but we don't want to, do regrettable substitutions. We don't want things that are in place of the old things that were bad and have new problems, of course. Like they've done in certain aspects of environmental health, but again, it's really looking at your own space. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's looking at your own space. It's seeing what you can do on a positive level. And is it also putting up blinders to some of these horrible situations around the world in the sense that since they feed such negativity and that frustration that you can't do anything about them? Because I find myself very frustrated wanting to be a global citizen, wanting to hear these stories, even in politics, wanting to hear what's going on, but then finding that they're eating at my soul from the inside out because I can't get over to those countries and fix that. So, what's the balance there?
That is a critical question as well, is finding that balance. And what you were talking about, this idea of wanting to be a global citizen, but feeling the pain so intensely, our young people are feeling that. And that's when I talk about eco-anxiety, which is a term, it's been around for about 15 years, but the dictionary, Oxford English Dictionary, actually just included it into the dictionary last fall. Eco-anxiety, which is a chronic fear of environmental doom. And the reason I connect what you're talking about to eco-anxiety is that we're seeing that young people, there was a survey last September of 10,000 young people, 16 through 25 globally. And 71% said that climate change and worry about climate change interferes with their daily lives. Excuse me. I'm sorry. It was 47% said it interferes with their daily lives. 71% said that they were very, very concerned about the future they're inheriting because of climate. And what you just talked about, this idea of wanting to be a global citizen and seeing kind of the pain around the world, is what I call, that's part of the eco-anxiety I call it the trifecta. And that is a hyper awareness of global issues that Gen Z has. I think a lot of parents, we think about social media, we think about Instagram, we think about Twitter, we think about TikTok, and that the kids are like really focused more on body image and, who's invited to what party. But in reality, a lot of them are sharing those news stories that you were talking about, Dr. Cohen, that you worry about, that make you feel that pain. And that contributes to their sense of overwhelm and their sense of anxiety about the future that they're inheriting. So what is the balance is the key question. And so that's what I do try to address in the book with this daily practice. If you do one green thing each day, you are doing what you can within your control. And you have to set your boundaries about what works for you. But what you may decide is that once a month, I'm going to make sure that I write a check. If you're a philanthropist, you're a giver. That's one of the personality profiles. That maybe you're going to do a fundraiser, or you'll write a check to an international aid organization. So when the next disaster hits that you've done, your part. Or you may want to go even deeper. You may want to plan a trip with your family and do like a service trip someplace. Or you may want to call a member of Congress and say, I'm really concerned about this. Or you may simply want to share newspaper articles with friends and family and talk about what can you do in your community to help the same issue. So the idea is that you create what works for you, but this daily practice that you keep up with keeps you grounded in your values and in your strengths and service, but also helps us move in that right direction. But I think that's something that we need to work on with our kids, is this balance of I think the message that they're hearing, and there was a great article in the New York Times just 2 weeks ago about, it's called, I think they called it climate doomsday scenario, isn't helping people, that we're constantly talking about all of the ills. We have to make that shift to talk about solutions. And I think that you do such a great job with this in the environmental health world. Like, hey, you can make this better choice. Look at this innovation that we're seeing. Yeah. But I think when it comes to the mental health of our young people, we need to start having conversations with them about the hopeful solutions that are out there, and that we're committed and it's not all on their shoulders.
Yeah, it's wonderful to talk about this, and it is a mental health component. I mean, there is a strong mental health component because if you don't have a sense of, and I see this with patients, if you don't have a sense of hope, or a reason to get out of bed in the morning, or a reason to put in effort, in your daily life, and COVID really knocked us down because it wasn't just about climate change. It was like, am I going to die today? I mean, and it's one of those things where I think we all got hit really like a couple triple whammies here. And it's been hard. I've seen this with my patients and myself, even, my family members, getting back to that feeling of motivation of making a difference, or even in our own lives, not just around the world. But and I think we have to be okay with that. There's a lot of patting yourself on the back and saying it's okay to be upset. It's okay to be frustrated, and connecting with people support you. But this is kind of, it's a group effort, but it's also probably an effort you can make on your own. I mean, I'll give one example, and then I'd love to hear all of your examples because you're the professional in this area, but I'm just looking at it from, so when we pick up takeout food, and we don't do it a lot, but, when we do, I've always not liked the plastics that, our hot food is served in. And so I've found a camping stainless steel, big, interior stainless steel as well, not just plastic on the inside and outside is stainless steel, but just a big camping, double insulated kind of, holds like 2 meals or something. And so I've made relationships with the local Indian food restaurant we love, and Chinese food restaurant we love. And I'll go and they'll put the food in that without even touching plastics or, cardboard takeout boxes that are actually lined with a lot of chemicals as well. And so that one move, and in the beginning, my kids were like, what? And my husband's like, oh my God, and all that. Now they're like, my husband's like, yeah, I'll take a soup with that too. And I'll say, it's funny how you can change the culture within your family just by showing it can be done. Now the kids don't even question it. So I just, little examples, it's not going to change, create world peace necessarily, but I'm just saying it's just those little things that we kind of add little by little. Drinking water is a big thing, using plastic water bottles. We use glass and stainless steel. It's good for the body, but it's also good for preventing, more plastics in the world that are, by the way, drinking water hydration is like the third biggest industry in the world besides oil and electricity. So how much petroleum goes into making, I think it's 407 billion pounds of petroleum go into making plastic bottles around the world. So just those little nuances in your own home, I think, could have a ripple effect. But tell me some of yours.
Oh, I love that example. I do. I love that example. I think that is so powerful because, again, not only within your family are you shifting the culture, the owners of those restaurants or the folks that are supporting them are like, oh, yeah, like this is possible. And there are...
Don't give me any trouble. And, not that they ever did, but they were like, what? And then they finally understand I don't want plastics in my body. And they totally get it now. So it's one of those funny things where you're changing... Right, the culture of the restaurant industry, perhaps, to allow it too.
You are, and again, it's not the solution, but it is showing people that there is another possibility there, and that's so exciting. And it's showing the people you love, but also the people that you vote with your wallet. You're supporting those restaurants. You want to be there, and that they're willing to work with you. And I think that's so exciting. Also, when you're talking about plastics, there's been some just really shocking research in the last 6 months about the idea of plastics being the new coal, that the oil and gas industry knows that their resources, we're going to see more and more of a market share coming from renewables as they come online from wind and solar, and that they are now doubling down on plastics, especially in developing countries. So I think that we're seeing a lot. There's a great movie called The Story of Plastic. It's depressing though, but it won an Emmy. It's very good.
No, it's great. Who is the author? Who's the person?
Dea Schlossberg.
Oh, Dave Schlossberg.
And Plastic Pollution Coalition was a producer of it, and
Fantastic.
It was on the Discovery Channel. But it's great. It's great. But the question I think you had for me was like, what do you do in your own family? Well, here's a fun thing: is that I am an outdoorsy person, but I do not have a green thumb. Like the joke in our house is that, I kill the house plants, and I'm just like, look, I'm in charge of a lot. Someone else needs to water the plants. But being out in Montana, I joke that I'm like living my Little House on the Prairie. Childhood, stories that I read. I'm now Laura Ingalls Wilder because right now it's 5 below zero and there's a lot of snow on the ground, and it's just very different from my DC and Southeastern United States upbringing being out here in Montana. But what I have done is I have a composter and I love it. And I sprinkle my compost on my weeds. I do not have a fancy garden. I don't even really have a container garden, but food waste is a big contributor to greenhouse gases. And I love that I'm doing my little composter. So that feels great. We don't have like citywide composting that you see in places like San Francisco or even outside of DC when I live there. So that makes me feel good. And then the other thing, as ridiculous as it may sound, my husband and I joke that Google Docs keeps our romance alive, but we do menu planning together. And so menu planning is a great way for us to not only save money, but also reduce our food waste.
Yeah.
And, we try to be mindful about how often we go out to eat. But obviously during the pandemic, we wanted to support the local restaurants because what an amazing a resource they are for us, as communities, but also the huge hit that they took during the pandemic. But that's one of the things that I do that seems so simple, but menu planning and composting. And again, I will tell you, my teenagers kind of roll their eyes like, nicely done, mom, slow clap for the composting. But the reality is it does make a difference. And of course, I call my members of Congress about how we need to pass the climate provisions of the Build Back Better legislation that needs to happen. And yes, I am working for these big solutions, but there's other things that you can do that can shift that culture. And the other thing that I think is really important, Dr. Cohen, and I know you talk about this to with your patients, is that it can be joyful. This idea of creating time in your life for joy, even if you're struggling with a very tough diagnosis or you're not really sure what the next step is, for you on your health journey, carving out time for joy each day. I mean, I would think it would feel really good. I'm going to try to, I have all this stainless steel ware, but the idea of taking it to, the Indian restaurant here in Bozeman and saying, hey, can you put it in this container? What a great idea. I don't do that. I would love to. That's such a great idea. Yeah. But that would bring me joy. It can be fun. And I think that's something that often we overlook when we're talking about these enormous issues we're facing as a collective, is that we can create joy as we're working towards these solutions.
Yeah, I think that what you're pointing out is, and I think that's probably what I'm expressing, is I feel like I beat the system. Like I beat the bad system. It's kind of like having a knockoff pocketbook and being like, oh, you think it's real? Well, I've got 5 other ones, but if they were real, I'd be out of a home. But yeah, I mean, there's something about sort of beating the system and feeling like, you're doing a good thing and there's a little bit of joy there because it worked. It actually worked. Yes. And it wasn't that difficult. And I love that you put in this joy tracker. Yeah. In your book. And, so tell me a little bit about that joy tracker since we're on the topic.
Sure. The idea is that doing this daily practice of sustainability, and again, you define it. I do have this 21-day plan to get you started. And we were talking a little bit earlier about this idea of who you are. Atomic Habits by James Clear is one of my favorite books. I highly recommend it. And one of the things he says is if you identify as a certain type of person, you're more likely to keep up with that habit. So if you identify as someone who is healthy, you're more likely to have healthy habits. If that's what you tell yourself, I'm a healthy person. This is who I am. And so the idea of the assessment is you're like, oh, I'm an adventurer. This is how I feel about the environment. So you're more likely to kind of keep up the practice, or I'm a sage, or I'm a spark. And you're more likely to kind of continue on this 21 days. But the idea is that this one green thing can be something, it can be protesting on March 25th for the global climate strike. But it can also be reading an important piece of scripture or a poem or even a letter of a loved one and just thinking about the environment and what it means to you. So there is a scale of engagement, but the idea is taking action each day, carving out time each day for this practice can increase the joy in your life. And so I have a joy tracker where you can say, hey, guess what? The walks were great. That brought me a lot of joy. Calling the member of Congress about energy policy, who I know is not aligned with what I think, it didn't make me feel as great, but you can kind of map out what practices, what one green things are bringing you the most joy. And then you can design the plan that works for you. And then I also have an opportunity in one of the chapters for an eco action plan where you can kind of take this idea of the one green thing and as a family sit down and, ideally intergenerationally sit down and talk about what you might want to do. And for me, my younger daughter was really interested in the idea of girls' education globally as a way to combat climate change, as a way to unlock more creativity for climate solutions, potentially reduce the number of children young girls have with equity, and create economic freedom for them. So she wanted to support the Malala Fund as part of her eco action. And one of the things she said, Mom, is $100 from an 8th grader going to make a difference? If I raise $100 for the Malala Fund. And the reality is, yeah, because you are making an impact. And then my older daughter, very focused on the Green New Deal. She tried to get friends to sign on to different petitions. That was part of her eco action plan. And again, Mom, online activism, does it make a difference? And the reality is it does. I mean, there's peer reviewed literature that says it does. And I know when I worked on the Hill, I looked at, my boss wanted to see how many people were writing about the different issues, pro, con, and how many people had signed these different online petitions. So there's a way that you can kind of come together as a family and think about it. You can track your joy, see what works for you, and then as a family, come up with a plan.
And, the thing that you just mentioned was sort of looking at the successes as a way to move us forward. I mean, even when we talked about, in the book that we wrote, Non-Toxic, we talked a lot about sort of the best public health changes that occurred in our history. We didn't have a lot of them, but we did have a lot of them. I mean, we do have, less pestilence, and we have, chlorinated drinking water for a reason. So we don't have typhoid Mary and all sorts of, major infectious issues and people dying from those. But it's, and also we took lead out of, gasoline and paints and solder for plumbing. And so some of these were some of the best public health measures. DDT we got rid of, even though it's still sticking around. I mean, so the idea is that I think that it's motivating to know that those movements were often started by small numbers of people, even the people, the doctors and researchers that got baby teeth, that had the lead lines and had parents from all over the country mailing in baby teeth so that they could show that children were absorbing lead, from their environment. I think these are the kinds of things that people didn't know were going to make an impression, but actually changed the law and really made public health changes that has now served us well without that. I mean, we have lead from other components and certainly other issues, but, certainly not in gasoline contributing to the problem. So, I think it's always good to show the successes, it's in order to empower the next success as opposed to sort of being Debbie Downer. And I think your book is that's the whole point. Your book is really saying, let's move on these positive efforts and let's keep going. And we can either do it together or you could do it individually. You have to know who you are. You can, tap into all your own personality traits to make it happen. So exactly. I think it's phenomenal. So a couple other questions. I certainly could have you here forever. I just want to keep going with some of the book things that you've done. You have a chapter called You Are What You Eat. And that's kind of stood out to me because can you explain a little bit about that chapter and kind of how you framed it?
Sure. Just the idea of how your food is grown, where it's grown, and by whom does affect climate change and, of course, affects your personal health. And so that's what inspired me. And actually, the entry point, I talk about a very positive food story I have, and that is when I was little, I used to spend a lot of time with my grandfather, who was much older. He was a dad in his 40s, which is really common now. But in 1945, when he was 45 and became a parent, that was not as common. So he was much older when I was little. And so I would go visit him and he would always make me apple pie. And, I didn't really I loved it. It was great. I didn't really think about it. And then I started this chapter by talking about apple picking with my girls, 20 years after he had passed. And as I kind of smell the apples and think about, I immediately get flooded with this memory of my grandfather making pies for me. And then Dr. Cohen, I had to sit down at a bench as I were checking out of this old timey, Apple store. I just had to say to my family, you check out. I sat down and I realized my grandfather had Parkinson's disease. And this gesture of making a pie must have been so challenging for him.
Unbelievable.
It took him an hour and a half to get dressed because of his tremor. And I had no idea. So I was just, overwhelmed with this gratitude for him. And then also just thinking about how important food is for family, for culture, but also obviously for our health. And so much of what you talk about is nutrition, reducing exposures to pesticides, being mindful of the water and how it's treated that you bring into your home. And I think it's just an important entry point for people to realize that food can be obviously an important part of who we are and the memories we have, but also fuels our body and fuels the planet too.
Do you have a garden?
I do not. I have weeds, though. My weeds are gorgeous. Yeah. I do not have a garden. I'm one of these people, like one of the things I had to realize and kind of let go, and this is where I think the assessment helped me, is that I want to be the type of person who has a garden.
Right.
My grandfather had an apple orchard and he had a beautiful garden, and I'm not that person.
Right.
But I can write great legal memos.
I totally relate. I mean, for all the work I do in environmental health, and you do, like, I want to be that one person who goes out and just picks their organic tomato and slices it with their extra virgin olive oil. And, I want to be that person, but it's just, I don't think I could keep a garden alive. I think that's one of my lifelong goals, is to have just a couple beds of raised beds for organic soil and organic seeds, and just really create my own food. I want to create my own food. I feel like I'm too dependent on the world to feed me.
Oh, yeah. And we can. I mean, there are always opportunities to do that. And there's always different times and spaces where you can do that. I just had to realize that I'm not there yet.
I'm not there yet. I don't have the time yet, but I feel like I want to do that. And my kids actually, one of my sons actually really has always wanted an organic garden, and we have the space to do it.
Yeah.
It's just, you have to tend a garden.
You do.
You actually have to go and tend it, take care of it, protect it.
You do.
There's a lot of metaphors in there, but so I'm just curious if, and that's really interesting that you say that, because you know who you are and you're okay with it.
I'm okay with it. I had to be okay with it. Yeah.
And you put your energies where you know you're going to do the best work. And I think that's really, that's reassuring.
That's right. And one of the profiles in the book is actually kind of fun. It's called the spark. And that personality is the person who's kind of wouldn't necessarily consider themselves an environmentalist, but that's the type of person to say, well, sure, I'm in. Yeah, I'll go with you to that lecture, or, hey, you want to do this event? Yeah, I'm in. And if we don't have the spark, there is no movement. You have to have someone who's ready to come with you and go along, even if it's not their primary motivator, because that's how we start to make a big difference. And I have to say, the kind of feedback I've gotten from a lot of people is like, I was so relieved. This idea of knowing who you are, like, I don't have a garden.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll have one 10 years from now. But I don't have a garden, and it's okay. It's also okay not to be the environmentalist who's going to host a fundraiser or testify before Congress or lead a protest. You can go along with a friend to, a lecture, and that counts. That's a spark. That's an important role.
No, that's important. You can't kind of preach these really important things if you don't have people that are sort of willing to participate or listen or support. I think you even dedicated the book to your spark, your this, your that. And I was kind of like, I have to really ask you about that, because now that you really have created these personality types, it kind of sticks in my mind now.
Yes.
Totally.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, now I was reading about you that 25 years ago you climbed Kilimanjaro, and you were sort of like an unwilling participant to some degree. You weren't really sure you were in good enough shape. And I was like, that's me. I would want to go just to say I did that. But tell me a little bit about that experience and some of those early exposures that kind of, taught you what you're made of.
Yeah. So I spent a summer in law school at the University of Nairobi Law School. And so I was studying international environmental law and comparative natural resources law. And, I could write a great memo. I love traveling. I love law, but I was not that physically fit. Right. And I had a group of friends that are like, we have to climb Kilimanjaro. We're here. We have to do it. It's one of these life experiences. And Aly, you're absolutely right. I was like, I need to tell people I did it, so I'm going to try it. So I did it. And the good news.
Well, when in Rome,
you have to try it. You have to try it.
When in Africa.
You got to do it. So the reality of this climb, and the climb I took was not a technical climb. It really is a walk up, but you have to go slow and let your body adjust to the lack of oxygen, which, I had no problem going slow. But we met this group of really fit British women, like ultra fit. And it was a 5 or 6 day climb, and you would go to, your stopping point would be at a different hut. And we were really slow. My group was super slow. And I was really slow. And these women who we didn't even know would make fun of us. They'd be like, oh my, in their British accents, which I'm not going to do my British accent because it's really bad. But they would make fun of us for being slow and being late and ask us how long it took. And just, they were really hoity-toity, as my mom would say about it. And it was very strange because we didn't even really know them. And it turns out, sure enough, that none of them made it to the top. And we made it to the top. I made it to the top because they went too fast. They weren't giving their bodies enough adjustment. So that was fun. And I say in the book, as my mom would say, bless their hearts, when I got to tell them that I made it to the top of you who peak. But what I write about in the book.
It's good to be humble.
It's good to be humble. Yeah. But what I thought about, in that moment, and I write about this in the book, is that I think a lot of people are afraid that experience I had with this group of very fit British folks is what it's like to be around environmentalists. And that hasn't been my experience, and my colleagues in the environmental community aren't this way. But I think they're afraid of being judged and afraid of doing sustainability wrong. They're afraid of making the wrong choice. They're like, can I be an environmentalist if I forgot my grocery bags? Hey, I don't have a hybrid. I don't have solar panels. Am I
right?
Can I be part
I'm
of
driving
this
a gas guzzling, car. Right. Should I be like driving like this?
Right. I can't be part of this movement. Yeah,
exactly.
And the reality is, of course, you can be part of this movement, and we need you to be part of this movement. And it's not about perfection. It is about progress. So I kind of use this experience in Kilimanjaro is that that's not the environmental community. We need to embrace everyone and bring them in and ask people you don't have to have a PhD to be part of this movement. You don't have to be an expert. You have to have a concern for the future, a willingness to learn and to work together. And I think that's so important because that's the only way we're going to be able to solve all of these complex problems. We can't be elitist about it. It's like we can't be the British ladies saying, oh my gosh, did you do this wrong? Did you do that wrong? And how long did it take you? It needs to be like, hey, we're all in this together. Let's get up the mountain together.
Right.
You do what you need to do, but let's give you some tips and some tools to make the right decisions for you. And when you go down this path, and I know this happens with a lot of folks who, especially in the environmental health movement, the more you learn and the more you see the challenges we face, the more sometimes you want to put the blanket over your head and just like watch Netflix and not, curl up in a blanket. And we can't do that. And that's why we have to just take this one step each day. And that can really add up and make a difference.
What do you say about all the kind of greenwashing stuff that's out there? I mean, it kind of pisses me off. I have to say, I hate to be crass about it, but are all dry cleaners that want to be green call themselves organic? And we know that there's no regulation on that whatsoever. So I don't even know what their chemicals they're using because there's no oversight. There's no regulation, and then we see green, pesticides and companies that you're like, all right, what are they using? Water and vinegar, like what's their chemical base? There are companies that do it right. I will tell you that, but they're few and far between. So I guess I'm kind of like upset that people are using this drama, future doom and gloom to kind of pad their pockets. And I'm just wondering what, from your perspective, having worked as a lawyer, knowing what's legal and what's not, having worked in advocacy for human health, for environmental health, and now even for, advocacy for the health of our planet. What does that mean to you? How do you reconcile that?
Oh, I feel the exact same way you do. It just fires me up. It's so frustrating. I think kind of stepping back, realizing that, okay, it does show the market. It does show the culture shift that we need. So that is a good thing. But we all, unfortunately, just have to be, buyer beware. We have to have our spidey senses up when people say that they are green and clean and taking care of things. The good news is that there are so many companies that want to be in this space. The bad news, as you said, is that it's not regulated, whether it be green cleaners, whether it be people saying they have clean beauty products. There's just a lot that needs to happen beyond the marketplace. There is a role for regulation. There is a role for the government saying what is safe and what's not. And unfortunately, it's not there. So I think that's where you do, and I do talk about different environmental organizations in the book, but that's where you want to look at your book as a resource, Dr. Cohen, which is like such a great resource for folks to make the right choices. And you need to support other watchdog organizations that are out there really trying to make sure that that it's not greenwashing, that it's actually appropriate. But we see this in the context of environmental health. We also see it in ESG and different companies saying that they're buying carbon offsets other places, but they aren't necessarily doing it, or the carbon offsets aren't regulated appropriately or not certified. So it becomes very complex quickly. And sometimes what happens is people just kind of throw up their hands. And that's where you have to just make the best decision you can, be aware, and then use these great resources that are out there, including, I think your book is a terrific one.
And it's interesting. I had a guest, Pete Myers, who works with Terrence Collins. And these are like really sort of like geniuses in the world of, he's an ornithologist. I mean, Pete loves, birds. And I'm sure he was heartbroken about the change in birds and populations through environmental changes. But what they're exploring is green chemistry and really trying to figure out which companies are making materials that work just as well, if not better, than plastics, that have, less carbon footprint, that are degradable over time, that don't live with us forever and potentially get into our bodies and our kids' bodies and our pets' bodies and water bodies and all that business. But, I think it's important also, and I think you give this balanced view of positivity, is that there are people really doing great work out there that are trying very hard to get this right and to pitch these major conglomerate companies on better materials. That if you start with cleaner compounds, you will make sure that your product does well, but it also recycles back, or it breaks down, recycles, and doesn't leave a stain on our earth. So what do you think about green chemistry? What's your experience with it?
I think that there's so much potential with green chemistry. I think the innovation is just thrilling. And that if we can put a person on the moon, we can certainly figure out how to create chemicals and consumer products that don't stay in our bodies for multiple generations and cause different health effects. So I think we've seen a tremendous amount of innovation there. And I think we've also seen some great consumer companies. Loop is a cool company where they deliver different personal care products to you, but they're in stainless steel packaging and they come back. I just had a call with someone who's working on like a pea pod type of grocery delivery service, but there's no plastic or cardboard that's tainted with fluorinated chemicals in their packaging and delivery. So there's all kinds of innovation that's happening right and left, and I think that's something that we need to put front and center. I love that you had Pete Myers' book, 1996 book, Our Stolen Future, was kind of a game changer for so many of us in this field and all of his tremendous work.
Right.
But we have to keep putting these solutions forward, with the caveat about the concern about greenwashing. But it is, one of the things that I talk about with my kids when we talk about coal and the legacy of coal. I mean, even folks who live in West Virginia, who this has been their heritage, their culture, their livelihood, they know coal is not the future. I mean, that is like saying to young people, VHS and cassette tapes are the future for you. That they know that that's not. So there is so much innovation. There is so much excitement in these solutions. We need to kind of have our balance of, this is serious. We are running out of time, but look at what we're doing right now. And then look at all of the potential that's ahead. I mean, not only can we have this innovation in green chemistry and sustainable design and integrative health, we can create, communities that are beautiful. Like, we can create a beautiful future together. We just have to make sure that we're focused on that and talking about these solutions in that way that is grounded in the common sense and the challenges we have. But it's easy, I think, for our young people to lose sight of what is possible.
Right. And that's what our job is. I mean, I think as older, wiser.
It's true, though.
Not sure if I'm wiser, but I like to think that. See, there you go. There's me thinking I'm wiser. But I mean, I think there's something that we owe the next generation. We failed them in certain areas, no doubt, our generations and our generations before. So we need to, I think the way you right the ship is, we have to give them the hope and give them some information that actually really inspires them. And your book certainly is part of the solution. So, I think having the roadmap, or at least having enough resources to really turn this around, it's important. And I think it's good for their mental health too, ours and theirs. So
absolutely.
So let's, great conversation. I'm so excited about your book, but I'm excited also about the work that you do on a regular basis, even consulting, even, vetting out all of these different companies and trying to, I try to call BS on some of them. I get called a lot about certain companies,
Sure.
and so, and it's inspiring on one side, but it's also a little daunting. But I think that if we wade through, the good stuff rises to the top is my feeling generally. Give us, maybe a top 5 list. I think people like 5, maybe not 10, but 5. What are the top 5 things that people could do right now that might influence, the picture of climate change and our future with, sustainability or what have you? Just give us 5 good, solid quickies.
Absolutely. I think the first and foremost is talk to a young person about climate change. I think one of the things that some of my friends, as I started on this book and writing this book, they were saying, well, Heather, of course your kids have eco-anxiety. You're an environmentalist and so is your husband.
Right.
And then I asked them to talk to their kids at the dinner table, and they were shocked because this is the number one concern for most Gen Zers, no matter your political affiliation, interestingly enough, or your background. It is front and foremost. So I think that's having the conversation, asking them, not just talking to them about climate change, but asking and listening. I think the second thing is reflecting on your own life about the positive changes you've seen on a societal level or a policy level. And I think you do a great job in this book about talking about these public health wins that we've had and intentionally telling young people about them, because they just assume that typhoid and yellow fever were never problems, right? Because they haven't talked about them in their daily lives. Like we need to talk about the huge changes that we've seen. Teach them
what's
Like just the idea of the nuclear freeze movement. My kids didn't know about it until I talked to them. I was like, actually, when I was growing up, we were really terrified that Russia was going to drop a nuclear bomb. Now, granted, we hid under our desks, and I'm not really sure how that would have saved us. But we need to talk about how there was a global movement to talk about the nuclear arms race. It seemed impossible. And obviously, there's still lots of issues globally, as we know, reading the paper even this morning about all that. But still, the reality is that we've done big things globally. And we need to tell them about it. So those 2 things. The third is get involved locally if you can and if you have time. Like listen to your local water board. Use the EWG Tap Water Atlas and see what's in your water and what are the challenges for your water utility. Be vocal if you can. I think the fourth thing would be school board. Obviously, there's been a lot of politics happening in school boards now, but if you can talk about sustainability education and climate change education, this idea that all jobs, even in the medical field, because of the impacts of natural disasters, will be actually climate jobs. And then I think that the fifth thing is, I know this sounds so simple, Dr. Cohen, but I think it is get to know your neighbors. The climate change that we're going to experience. I know here in Bozeman, we have wildfires. Knowing your neighbors and knowing who they are during an emergency, it may be really critical for you. Obviously it's important for happiness. It's important for connection, but it may logistically be really important for you too.
That's actually a really great point.
Because I'll tell you something, things, that I would say.
When we had Hurricane Sandy, I met neighbors, and just because we were sharing one cord from one generator, 3 houses up, split between 5 homes. It was like I'd never met these folks before, and yet they were sharing their energy with us so we could function. And it did change my perspective on the neighborhood. It did show me that even if our politics are not the same, which is very variable in our town, that we all have a common goal of survival, of being fruitful. I think that's a really good one that I think people miss. So good for you. That's a really good number 5. So that's really good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So tell me, those are good. So tell me, how do people reach you? How do people read about you? How do people get your book? What's the best way to sort of learn more about Heather and this book?
Oh, thank you so much. So my book is One Green Thing, Discover Your Hidden Power to Help Save the Planet. And it's available at any bookstore that you love and available online, Amazon to Target to IndieBound to Bookshop. You name it, it's there. HeatherWhite.com is my personal site, and then onegreenthing.org. I would love it if your readers and followers would be interested in following me at One Green Thing on Instagram, at Heather White Official as well. And then taking the Service Superpower Assessment, I think might be a fun tool and a fun way for your followers and audience to think about how they might show up for others in service and how they might want to be involved in this movement, which I think ultimately all of us will be part of as we think about our future together and what we're leaving our kids and grandkids.
Do you do lectures? I mean, are you
absolutely.
So something like, for instance, if you wanted to speak, I mean, if someone wanted to get you to speak to a school or to,
I would love to speak to schools, especially. Good. And I have on my website kind of book bundles. I'm happy to Zoom into book clubs. If, folks want to order 12 books, I'll Zoom into a book club, 50 for community. And soon, I think we'll start traveling, but you'll have to tell us, Dr. Cohen, if we're going to be able to really travel. It feels like we're going to be able to travel, really, really soon.
I'm traveling and I'm traveling safely. The way I look at it is if you're, vaccinated and boosted and, I mean, if you can't, that's a whole nother story we can't get into. But I mean, I think when you wear a shield and you wear an N95 and you really protect yourself, you carry your alcohol, your isopropyl alcohol, I think you can do it. Of course, I don't say this for everybody, certainly. Sure. With my patient load, but I'm saying I think and you have to know your sort of viral count of your local town and where you're going and that kind of thing. But yeah, I'm optimistic. But listen, I'll tell you, it has been a pleasure.
Thank you so
hanging
much.
out with you and chatting, and I learned a lot, and I'm very excited for this book to come out. And I kind of feel like they hold side by side. They're like bookends, environmental health, the human body, greening your body, greening the world, and how they intersect are so critical. And I think that, your history tells it all in terms of what you've produced here. So it's been great having you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity and for all the great work that you do.
My pleasure. And it takes a village. So thank you for being part of it. So take care. Thank you.